Okay, we are here today to talk about the very beginnings of literature. The first major unit we're going to look at in our study of world literature is what the first stories were that cultures started telling. And we're going to look at several different cultures from several different parts of the world and talk about the common kinds of stories that they all told. So when we look at the beginnings of literature, one thing we're going to notice is that most of the stories that people tell are stories that they tell in order to answer a question. So think about it for a moment. What kind of questions do you think people are most interested in answering? What we discover when we look at the earliest examples of literature, of stories that people told each other that were recorded and passed on for many generations, is that people are interested in where the world came from, why the world is the way it is, where human beings came from, what human beings are supposed to do while they're here on Earth, and maybe most importantly, where do we go when we're done being human beings, when we die? We discover that almost all cultures start by telling stories that try to answer those basic questions. And we're going to notice some similarities, some things that unify all those cultures, but also some ways that they're very different. So one of the things that we're going to think about as we study the beginnings of civilizations is how the different aspects of their cultures can be seen in their literature. What we're going to start looking at are what we call epics. The epic is one of the earliest forms of literature, and many different cultures told epics. It's a word that we use today kind of as an adjective just to mean something large or impressive in scale. That test was epic or something like that. But in an English class, an epic is a specific kind of literature. You need to know, and you should record all of this in your notes, by the way, that epics are long poems, many of which come from pre-literate societies. Most of the literature we're going to look at in this unit was passed down by oral tradition for a long time before it was ever written down. It's part of the reason why these works of literature were originated as poetry, because for some reasons we'll talk about in class, poetry is much easier to remember and pass down orally than what we call prose. Epics are usually written in an elevated style. They make use of epithets, they have larger-than-life conflicts, and repetitive language and situations. Let's talk about what we mean by some of those things, because you should have these traits in your notes as well. By an elevated style, we mean that epics take what's going on very seriously and describe things in very sort of intense language. If you could imagine an epic about someone brushing their teeth, an epic would make it sound like it was the most incredible act of toothbrushing ever to take place. Epics make use of epithets. An epithet is a consistent way of referring to someone or something. It's a little bit of language that an author uses and always sort of attaches to a person or a place as a way of sort of titling them. So for example, if you decided to start calling me Mr. Kennedy the Bold or something like that, and every time you referred to me you said, "Oh, here comes Mr. Kennedy the Bold," you are now using an epithet to refer to me. The conflicts in epic are typically larger than life. They involve huge stakes. They involve elements of the supernatural and gods and humans battling and things like that. There aren't really any epics about small day-to-day problems. And there are many repeated situations. The same things have a tendency to happen over and over again, often following the same kind of patterns. That, the hero is going to fight a series of monsters, and often those battles are described in the same language. If you stop and look at most of those qualities that we just pointed out, you should be able to see how those make sense for something that was passed down through oral tradition. A lot of those are in there to make epics easier to remember. Epics usually cover the entire known world. So as much as a culture knows about the world, we see all of that in an epic. That includes both sort of the physical world. Characters in epics almost always go on a journey. The psychological world will see characters with very different motivations, characters with very different personality traits. The theological world, it's a very common element in an epic to have a character, for example, travel to the land of the dead. As I said, epics are, almost always involve contact between humans and gods. Epics are about epic heroes. And you should definitely know that an epic hero is a larger-than-life hero who represents the most important values of a culture. So by larger-than-life, we mean they are exaggerated to the point that they're not believable. And when we say they represent the most important values of a culture, we mean we can look at an epic hero and see whatever it is that that culture thought a human being should be. So, as an example, if you read the epic poem Beowulf, which is sort of a Viking epic, the hero of Beowulf is very sort of violent and strong and does things through physical force. He's this sort of Viking warlord. And then if you read the Odyssey, which is an epic poem from ancient Greece, you'll see a hero who is very wise and intelligent. Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, succeeds not because he's the greatest warrior, but because he's often the smartest character involved. So you can see sort of different things that those civilizations value by looking at their epic heroes. Epics, as we've been saying, are very reflective of culture. So epics often represent their culture's efforts to answer some of these important questions. Where do we come from? What's important in life? Where are we going? Who created us? What do they want us to do? You might think that epics aren't things that come up in modern literature, but there are actually a lot of stories that fit many elements of this sort of epic pattern. Think, for example, about a character like Batman. Batman is a larger-than-life hero who does battle with these sort of exaggerated supernatural enemies. Batman represents many of the values that our culture, that 21st century American culture, values. He is independent. He is willing to make sacrifices. He he's both wealthy, but has also sort of built himself into something psychologically and physically. And we can keep going, or think about other superheroes. Superhero movies are all very popular right now, and they're the epics of our time. Think about some of these other superhero movies that are out there and what they say about our culture and the values that we share. Okay, so let's talk about Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first text that we are going to look at in our study of epic literature. Gilgamesh was a king from ancient Sumeria. So the historical Gilgamesh and the literary character Gilgamesh are kings from ancient Sumeria. He probably lived between 2700 and 2500 BC. Now, by the way, a lot of this is going to overlap if you're taking AP World, and you should know a few things about ancient Sumer at this point. But we say that Gilgamesh probably lived sometime between 27 and 2500 BC because he's from a pre-literate society. There aren't really written records. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is this long poem that was passed down by oral tradition and talks about Gilgamesh meeting gods and things like that, is the best record that we have of him. But he probably did exist. There probably was someone like Gilgamesh, maybe called Gilgamesh. He did some impressive things. And it was sometime between 27 and 2500 BC. The poem wasn't written down until the 21st century BC. So you can see that hundreds of years pass between the life of the historical Gilgamesh and the time when his story is finally written down. So during that time, the story was being passed down via oral tradition and obviously becoming exaggerated and changed, and we're really not sure how much of it to believe. Now, the text of Gilgamesh was lost when ancient Babylon fell. But in the 1880s, a 7th century copy was discovered in an ancient library. So the version that we have doesn't date back to the 21st century. It's a much more recent version that, again, we have some oral tradition and recopying and things going on. So stop for a minute and think about how much older the story of Gilgamesh is than the founding of the Roman Empire. If Gilgamesh was living in the year 2500 BC and Rome was founded in 44 BC, and right now it's 2013, we are closer to the founding of ancient Rome than the ancient Romans were to the life of Gilgamesh. Do some math in your head. how much older was Gilgamesh than the discovery of America or the founding of the United States, the publishing of the To Kill a Mockingbird, the novel that we just studied. This is about the earliest story that we have record of. So we have jumped all the way back to the beginnings of recorded history when we're going to look at Gilgamesh. Think about how many lifetimes Gilgamesh could have lived since his story was first told. And as we'll see, Gilgamesh may very well be immortal. Here's an interesting graphic I found that shows sort of the evolution of written language. And you can get a sense of what if people had written records at the time of Gilgamesh, what they looked like. Notice the big jump that occurs between say 3000 BC, when things are basically still being represented with pictures, and 2400 BC, when they're starting to be represented by symbols, and 1000 BC, when they're being represented by things that realistically look like a language. And you can understand why it took so long for this poem to be written down. If you look in this first column here, it would be next to impossible to write a complete story using those pictographs for every word. So we can't get a written version of Gilgamesh until written language has evolved to the point where it can be used that way. I said that Gilgamesh is a king from ancient Sumer. So Sumer was in the Fertile Crescent, along with places like Babylon, which you've probably also heard of. So here we see a map of the Middle East with the Fertile Crescent on it and these ancient civilizations in it. Here's a more modern map that'll give you a sense of where the Fertile Crescent is. As you can see, Gilgamesh would have lived in present-day Iraq. And here's a political map that again shows you where he would be. These are maps that you're probably a little bit familiar with because they're in the news so often. But again, this is the area where Gilgamesh would have lived. His city of Uruk is in there. These are some pictures that show you archaeological digs in ancient Sumerian cities. These are some images that you might be able to find today if you went there. This is what's left of Gilgamesh's civilization. But here's an artist's conception of what a city like Uruk might have looked like at the time when Gilgamesh was living there. The other idea that we're going to talk about when we talk about epics is the idea of an archetype. An archetype, and this is again something you should definitely have in your notes. An archetype is a story or character that's repeated in many different stories from many different cultures. What we'll discover when we start looking at epics is that all these different civilizations from different places on the globe who didn't have a lot of contact with each other tell not only the same types of stories, but include a lot of the same characters or situations. True archetypes aren't repeated intentionally, but develop independently of each other. So some psychologists think that we sort of have these basic archetypes, these basic kinds of characters in our sort of shared human consciousness or something like that, which is why they keep coming up over and over again. Today, in a lot of stories, people will intentionally use archetypes to increase their story's appeal. So you'll see them in a lot of 20th and 21st century literature, especially movies, use a lot of archetypes. Intentionally sort of trying to find these characters and situations that sort of connect all different kinds of literature. So some common archetypes, and think about different stories that you might be familiar with that use these characters. Think about the number of stories that have a young boy or otherwise insignificant or weak person who learns to wield a great power. How many times has that story been told? Probably in movies that you've seen even recently. How often does that young boy or otherwise weak person have a wise old man who helps the boy on his quest? There's often an evil guy who usually is dressed in black who attempts to block the young boy. And we often have a trickster or rogue character whose allegiances are questionable. We're not really sure if we should trust this character. Think about stories that you've encountered that have these same characters in them who go through a lot of these same conflicts. Some that immediately come to my mind are this story and this one. But I'm sure you can come up with a lot more. So that's the kind of thing I'm hoping you will bring to our class discussion as we get ready to start reading the Epic of Gilgamesh and talking about some of these big questions in more detail.